It's the future of our entire country that's at stake.
I've spent all my life campaigning for this. We all have.
On the 18th of September 2014, 2 years of campaigning would come to an end. Scotland would vote on independence. In the final weeks, a contest that once looked like a sure thing was suddenly too close to call.
Phone goes and it's the Downing Street switchboard saying, "I've got the Prime Minister for you."
We were confronted with the prospect that we were going to lose this.
Faster, safer, better.
Whatever had been thrown at us up until then was nothing compared to the onslaught we were going to get for the next 10 days.
Northlink Ferries are pleased to welcome on board Miss Nicola Sturgeon.
The ferry from Aberdeen to Shetland. It's an overnight ferry. It takes about, 13 hours or something. And I had this idea, because I'd been doing these town halls up and down the country for months. I did a, 45-minute, an hour presentation with no notes. It was all in my head. And I thought, well, why don't we just try to do one on the ferry? I should warn you, I'm not entirely sure how good my sea legs are. And it was fantastic. I was having to battle seasickness at the time as I stood there giving my pitch, but I managed to keep it under control, and it was good fun, yeah, but quite a bizarre experience. You felt you were winning it person by person, and that I loved that. I would, love to go back and do that all over again.
When the referendum campaign began in 2012, yes trailed no by over 20 points in the polls. Now, with less than 3 weeks to go, momentum, especially on the streets, seemed to be going in their direction.
Every time that I looked on social media and there was rallies going on and people joining together to try and make something better for all of us, then it kind of, it made me excited.
To me, it's the healthiest thing that came out of that referendum, was just that getting people over that line to go, do you know what, I'm going to just get a table and put it out in the high street, and I'm just going to talk to people about why they should vote a certain way.
We just needed literally a table, some shelter, and ideally a speaker to play some good disco. And other than that, off we went.
So your first time voting as well? Aye. Do you think that's quite interesting? There's so many people first time voting.
For me, that was my dream, Scotland. Literally being able to stop anyone from any background, any age, any gender, anyone, people from the EU, people from all around the world, were all so interested and so enlivened when you asked them, what do you think about all this?
And I completely get that every nationalist said their nationalism's uniquely different. I get that. I don't believe it, but I get it.
It was scary. I mean, it was scary in an exciting way, but it really felt like this is what it feels like when you're on the verge of a real revolution.
On our own, we can cut the mustard.
It's often said, particularly on the national side, it was a festival of democracy, but I think a lot of no voters were, reluctant to say very much about it.
We're gonna be in there.
We all were exhausted every day, but every morning we were up and we were out in the rain and the sunshine and everything, because it was just so enlivening. It was democracy in action. It was beautiful.
I thought it was a good way of spreading the word.
That is commitment.
Yeah, certainly
well
is.
done.
Do you think you should follow suit?
I'm not sure, but, he's maybe shamed me into it.
The wrist is not the most unusual place I've seen people with yes tattooed on their bodies. I've seen weird and wonderful ways in which people have expressed their undying support for Scottish independence, but I'm not going to get into any more detail of that.
And I see they're all voting yes.
Yes, everybody.
Yes, they're all
Did you get
yes,
that?
yes.
Everybody is voting yes.
I started to think we were probably not in the lead, but very close to a sort of taking the lead.
On September the 4th, so exactly 2 weeks before polling day, I had undertaken a public debate in East Lothian at the invitation of Ian Gray, the local MSP. I'd done dozens of those debates by then in town halls and village halls and community centres and church halls across the country. but I was deeply troubled by the reaction that night.
I remember Douglas phoning me in the evening, very frustrated. He said, you know when you've had a good debate, you know when it's gone quite well. He said, I know I won that argument, I won that debate, but I also know that I lost it.
Something is shifting.
This was the biggest issue facing the government. You needed to prepare for every eventuality. So it was agreed that we would do a daily tracking poll. We got the first results on the Friday when the Prime Minister was down at the NATO summit in South Wales. And, it was not good news.
The government's poll was secret, but on that same Friday afternoon, YouGov, polling for the Sunday Times, sent the results of their latest poll to the paper's editors. The Sunday Times poll would soon be public.
We did briefings for the Sunday media on a Friday afternoon. Jason Allardyce, the Sunday Times Scotland editor, came along, and we knew that he had a poll, and we knew that he knew what the result was.
Nicola Sturgeon was very well aware of the fact that we had a poll, so I was kind of pretty much locked in a room at the end of this briefing and kind of interrogated by Nicola.
I didn't lock him in a room. I think that's a slight exaggeration. I may have barred the door so that he couldn't get out of the room.
She started off by asking me about the poll and what was in it.
Come on, just tell me. I won't tell anybody. Just between you and me, Jason. And when that clearly wasn't working, I decided to come at it from a different angle. So I said, is it interesting?
It's definitely interesting, yeah.
And I think we unlocked the door and let him go at that point. And I remember thinking, well, interesting, what's that?
There's a few people of a certain age.
The next afternoon, Saturday, Alex Salmon was campaigning in Inverness.
People queuing up in South Africa to vote. You remember that?
Yeah, I do.
The Sunday Times was now ready to release the results of its poll.
Register to vote.
I've never been on a street campaign like it. It was just the most amazing event in the centre of Inverness, and a joy to behold. And clearly sentiment was running very, very strongly.
This campaign, this message is Scotland's future in Scotland's hands. Thank you very much.
And then I thought to myself, well, this will be my last opportunity to get a game of golf for some considerable time.
I phoned him when he was on the golf course, and I told him that it was 51-49 in favour of yes.
Jeff Aberdeen doesn't agree with this because he says he was perfectly clear about it. But I spent the rest of the round believing it was 51-49 for no, which would have been a great poll for us. But by the time I got to the clubhouse and saw the number of messages there were, I caught up with things pretty quickly.
In Scotland, referendum campaigning intensifies as a new poll suggests for the first time a majority in favour of leaving the UK.
Inside Whitehall, the secret poll, commissioned by the government, had also been received.
I was aware that a poll obviously was due, and I went and asked what the result of that was, and there was a lot of kind of awkward shuffling around and people saying that they were unaware or that they hadn't been given access to it. So I had a conversation with the civil servant who had received it, who then showed it to me with some nervousness, asking me not to share it more widely, which of course I respected. But it showed that lead for the Yes campaign was actually 4 points. There was a clampdown on who had access to it.
When those polls came through, both the internal poll and then, of course, the one on the Sunday Times, it was a big shock.
I mean, my first reaction was, oh, fuck, as I heard it on the phone.
My overwhelming recollection of when the YouGov poll came out was overwhelming panic of people all around the Better Together offices.
It was always an interesting moment at Yes when an opinion poll came out, because inevitably we would be behind. We all got very, very good at going through polling data to find the thing that showed support for Yes has increased among 17 to 19-year-olds, and then we put up a graphic with the magic words, the momentum is with Yes, at the bottom of it. And then there was the poll that put us ahead, and I literally stared at that for 10 minutes and I realised I had nothing to say, that I'd been so I've been so used to saying the momentum is still with yes, or we're catching them up, or we're nearly there, to actually say we're ahead was a difficult point to be in. Oh my God, we're ahead. Hooray! But what do I do now?
The Yes campaign is not complacent in any way, shape or form. We've always believed that if we patiently persuaded people of the positive case for independence, we would win. I knew at that point, I think we all knew at that point, that whatever had been thrown at us up until then was nothing compared to the onslaught we were going to get for the next 10 days.
In a perfect universe, in a parallel universe, that poll was not 11 days before, not giving our opponents time to react.
It was really more accident than design. As it happened, YouGov were just at capacity, unfortunately, already for that final weekend. So we thought, well, get YouGov to go ahead with one a week early and see how we get on.
The Prime Minister had left Wales. He was now in Scotland. So too was the Queen, who was watching the Braemar Highland Games, a regular visit that began in 1948.
The phone goes and it's the Downing Street switchboard saying, I've got the Prime Minister for you. And when that happens, you always sort of gulp a bit and think, Her Majesty the Queen had been sort of grilling the Prime Minister a bit on how confident he was that this was going to play out as he had assured her. And so he phoned me to further reassure him.
Andrew Cooper, our pollster, had said, look, the people who are going to vote with their hearts and probably for independence will peel off first and declare. And I said, you mean the polls are going to converge? And he said, yes.
I'm looking at the small print of the polls, and I'm seeing that not only are yes ahead by 2 points, but looking at where voters are on some of the other big issues, well, they're clearly trusting Alex Salmond much more than they're trusting David Cameron. They're trusting Nicola Sturgeon much more than they're trusting Ed Miliband. So they're way, way ahead on trust here. And you're seeing that every single age group, with the exception of over 60s, is now pro-independence, which is astonishing. And then they're saying that, yes, they think the economy would be slightly worse off. They think that they themselves would be a bit worse off as well. And yet they're still planning to vote yes. So really, the devil is almost in the detail, not just the headline for the No campaign. How do you get out of that?
If you get a poll that's for you or against you, it creates a sort of a momentum. The only way to displace that is to start, talking about something else.
The No team would have their chance that Sunday morning. George Osborne was scheduled to appear on the BBC's Andrew Marr show.
It was a sort of conference call. I was at home. George Osborne was in number 11 with his Treasury advisors, and the Prime Minister was in Balmoral, and it was discussing what line should George Osborne take.
We were confronted with the prospect that we were going to lose this very, very important referendum for the future of our country.
For 2.5 years, the line out of Downing Street was that if Scotland voted no, then Westminster would devolve greater powers to the Holyrood Parliament. Now they discussed making this a concrete offer before the vote.
The phrase was faster, safer, better change, and that was the proposition. And I put advice to the Prime Minister and the Chancellor. It would stop it all being about the opinion poll.
I didn't speak to David Cameron when he was at Balmoral, but I spoke to George Osborne and he just got off the phone with him because George was on the way to do the Marr interview.
I phoned her and said, look, this is where we've got to, this is what we're planning to do. I think, she was understandably robust about, do you really want to change everything around?
The phrase I keep remember saying was, I wish people would just hold their effing nerve. That's what we need to do, is we need to hold our effing nerve.
And I think people like Ruth, who, I think is absolutely brilliant in the heat of the campaign up north of the border, of course were saying, well, look, don't suddenly change things around. Whereas I think we were trying to think, are there small adjustments we can make that will just reinforce the message we've already been giving? But, we had really thought about this.
We had a broad-based discussion where frank views were exchanged.
So you will see in the next few days a plan of action to give more powers to Scotland, more tax powers, more spending powers, more plans and powers over the welfare state. And that will be put into effect. The timetable for delivering that will be put into effect the moment there is a no vote in the referendum. The clock will be ticking for delivering those powers, and then Scotland will have the best of both worlds. They will both avoid the risks of separation, but have more control over their own destiny, which is where I think many Scots want to be.
We're talking about more tax-raising powers?
More tax-raising powers.
Going as far as fiscal autonomy?
Well, much greater fiscal autonomy. Let's wait and see the proposal we have in the next few days. All of which, I think, satisfy a Scottish demand that decisions that affect Scotland are taken in Scotland without the risks.
I had gone to Dundee for a family wedding, and it was a proper Scottish wedding with the resultant proper hangover. And I got up at my mother-in-law's house, slightly bleary-eyed, switched on the television.
Alex Salmond scored a bit of a blow when he attacked Alistair Darling for the lack of job-creating powers for the Scottish Parliament. Would that also be included in this agreement?
And I watched the television, growing increasingly frustrated and exasperated that we didn't know what it was that we were being offered. Up to that point, the No campaign, because they were very, very reluctant bedfellows, I don't think at times they could even agree which day of the week it was, let alone what they were offering the people of Scotland as an alternative to independence. I drove back to Glasgow with my wife and kids sleeping in the back, formulating what I wanted to do in the paper. Came into the office, typed away furiously a very long 1,000-word Daily Record view saying that they have to come clean with what it is they're offering because this is not acceptable. And we did the front page that turned the leaders into the three blithe monkeys. Hear no devo, see no devo, speak no devo.
We were feeding in research insights, trying to get some substance out of the focus groups about was there anything that people felt particularly clearly or strongly about in terms of more devolved power. And what they wanted, I think, was everything possible that Scotland could decide for itself to be decided for itself in Scotland that is consistent with still being in the United Kingdom.
Even before that poll that suggested that independence might get a majority and they might win the referendum, I was aware that we had to get these two messages across, that we stood for a strong Scotland within the United Kingdom with a strong Scottish Parliament, and we were in favour of change and not in favour of the status quo.
We are proposing, Joanne, the Labour Party, Ed Miliband, that over the next few months we agree a programme that the Scottish Parliament should have increased powers in welfare, in social and economic policy, and in finance. We're also proposing that there is a timetable for delivery. So immediately the referendum is over on September the 19th, we start the process of new laws to enhance the powers of the Parliament.
We could then say, we have proposals for change, we have a timetable for change.
With less than 10 days to go, the Yes campaign was suddenly on the back foot, having to react to the other side's moves.
Given that most people have tended to say that they want more powers short of independence, aren't they likely to be tempted by the timetable for more powers promised by the other three parties?
Well, unfortunately what they're offering is too little, too late. It's a last-gasp act of desperation from politicians who have not a shred of credibility in Scotland.
I'd have been much more comfortable if they'd stayed on the total relentless negativity. You know, this'll close, that'll close, it's all a disaster, Scotland can't do it, don't be silly. That sort of stuff had, as I think, run its course and had failed.
So suddenly it's chaos. Prime Minister's Questions is cancelled. David Cameron and Ed Miliband and Nick Clegg abandon everything else and head north to Scotland to try to salvage the situation.
You see, the SNP were trying to pretend to everyone that it was just a small step, it was just a small thing, and it was, you know, and it was all to do with Braveheart, and it would be a, you know, nice thing for Scotland. We needed to tell people, no, this is a really big decision. Cancelling PMQs and other devices like that were required to dramatise the nature of the decision.
I was not a fan of the idea of the Prime Minister and Ed Miliband and Nick Clegg all deciding at the last minute they were going to chuck Prime Minister's questions and dash to Scotland. Again, it was a gimmick. It really annoyed me because at that point, and I kept going around telling everybody it was time to hold your effing nerve, it just seemed like panic had set in, and it would look to the public like panic had set in. I mean, what was David Cameron going to do? He wasn't about to start knocking doors in Shettleston, and everybody knew it.
I think I was the only one of the three, of Miliband, Cameron and myself, to actually do a sort of spontaneous walkabout, I think, in Selkirk Marketplace. I got some support and was also received a fair amount of barracking too.
I see David Cameron said his house bitch to deal with our problems today.
By that stage, I'd been knocking around on campaign trails for a very, very long period of time, and so happened to quite enjoy, in a rather odd sort of masochistic way, being shouted at as much as being applauded.
In anything you do in a campaign, there is a risk. But, you know, the biggest risk is not doing enough.
For its part, the Labour Party decided to send a train full of MPs to Glasgow for a big rally. What could go wrong?
It's all down to us.
The idea of please don't go, the idea of the members of Parliament from Liverpool, Manchester, Swansea, Cardiff, London, wherever, coming and saying, this is about social solidarity, don't go. I thought that was an important argument.
So I guess the story began with me having a hangover in my bed and getting a phone call, a very hazy phone call from a friend. Matt, I don't know what you're doing right now. I'm really hungover. Okay, sorry about that. Sorry for waking you up. But I have a tip-off from a friend of a friend whose dad is a journalist, who has just told me that 100 Labour MPs are going to be arriving at Central Station in an hour's time. I was like, what? Oh, all right, okay, thinking, just like going from hangover mind into action mind. I basically told everybody, don't ask any questions, very hurried and very excited calls. Don't ask any questions, just meet me as quick as you can. I don't care what you're doing. And thanks to this voter registration stall that we'd been running on Buchanan Street, we had a rickshaw ready to go with a speaker in it. It was luckily with some battery in it, with a microphone all plugged in. We had it all set up, ready to go. So the universe was on our side, you know? And within half an hour, we were just at the side street coming out of Central Station was these, sure enough, 100 Labour MPs with a whole horde of media following them.
The Scottish Labour Party was up at the steps next to Donald Du's statue in the city centre, and these MPs come off the train station. And I thought, you know what, I'm not going to be roped in up at the steps. So I went and watched from a distance the MPs. And there was this guy turned up.
Our Imperial Masters have arrived. Welcome, our Imperial Masters. Welcome to Scotland.
The Darth Vader, The Empire Strikes Back, played at a decibel level that drowned out everything else. It was absolutely brilliant.
Welcome to Scotland. Welcome, one and all.
Yes. Oh yeah, it was hilarious.
That was the funniest moment of the campaign.
You could see in some of their faces just pure confusion, and some of them had a little smirk. They could see the funny side of it.
Is that what they're doing?
Some of them were utterly raging. How dare we come and, you know, pee on their parade, shall we say?
Look at a wee sense of humour. Look at a wee sense of humour, hen. Not really, not with me. That's a shame. I was going to try and convince you there, but oh well. Clearly you're not here to try and convince me. I'm bowing down, I'm here to support you. Be thankful they've travelled all the way. Don't worry, they've got it on their expenses bill.
I spent months, years, telling people to make your videos short. This goes on and on and on. It just gets funnier and funnier and funnier as these kind of like perturbed MPs try to work out what to do as this guy follows him down.
Get on your knees and bow down to the Labour Party!
I actually think that was the soundtrack of a party that's out of touch with the people of Scotland, a party that doesn't know how to react to the man in the street, OK, usually a man in the street doesn't have a rickshaw and an amp, but even so...
People of Glasgow, your imperial masters have arrived!
As professionals, we thought it was probably not great television for our side, but it was very funny.
Most of the television news bulletins ignored Matt Lygate's stunt, but the video he shot still became one of the viral hits of the referendum.
I was in London with a bunch of friends, and we were out for the evening. And they said to me, what the hell is this in Scotland? What's happening in Scotland? Where has this suddenly come from, this support for independence? And I said, OK, let's go around the table and see if we can drum up for ourselves what the roots of this phenomenon are. And basically, by the end of a very short discussion, I said, OK, you've identified between you two causes. One, the Scots are chippy, and two, Alex Salmond's wily. I said, if that's what you think it is, if you think it's as shallow and insignificant as that, you haven't understood what's been going on in Scotland for the last 30 or 40 years. And I wrote a piece for the BBC website, 4,000 words. They put very high production values on it. They embedded it with archive photographs, clips of old news stories from the 70s and 80s and earlier. To me, it was full of stuff that I had understood for a long time. But to people in London, to my astonishment, they were hearing some of the arguments that I was making for the first time. And the head of news rang and said, listen, you've got to put this on television. You've got to make this argument on TV. He said, make a panorama. And I said, well, the referendum's next week. You can't make a panorama in a week. And he said, well, you have to try.
When I was growing up in Scotland, the British state counted for an awful lot. It bound the British together in a common purpose, a great kind of shared enterprise. The British state dug coal, it milled steel, it built ships. There were shipyards all along this stretch of the river here. It even manufactured motor cars. But by the 1970s, all that had begun to change.
While I was doing that, in those really that last weekend before the vote, I obviously I couldn't do that and the news, so I stopped reporting the news for a few days, and that was done by other people.
David Cameron raced out of Scotland just as he raced in. His message, very simple. This is not about me. This is not about those he called the effing Tories. It's not about the next 5 years. It's forever.
Very early on, I said to BBC News managers, look, am I as political editor based in Westminster, am I going to be covering this campaign or not? Because if I am, I need to go up regularly. I need to not just feel part of the story, I need to win the trust of people involved. And over the years, I've covered Scottish politics a lot, but I felt I needed to do it a lot more. As we said, they didn't quite listen to the warning that if I was sent at the last minute, that if I could be presented as the guy in a suit from Westminster, the Englishman from the British Broadcasting Corporation, that would be tricky.
One of the most dramatic effects of the Sunday Times poll, suggesting yes might win, was just coming to a head. Until now, big Scottish businesses had been largely staying out of the fight.
We were all on the phone to these businesses saying, not make things up or say things you don't want to say, but if you've done the work privately on what independence means for your business, then you have a duty to say to both the Scottish public and indeed to your own workforces what those consequences are. And many of them responded to that call.
One of Scotland's biggest names in pensions and savings, Standard Life, which has been based here for nearly 200 years, confirmed today it was preparing to transfer parts of the business to England if Scotland voted for independence.
Some of the UK's leading retailers, including Asda and John Lewis, have suggested a yes vote in next week's Scottish referendum could have an impact on their prices. It's emerged tonight that the Prime Minister has been talking to supermarket bosses about going public on the issue.
Contingency announcements from businesses carried political weight. For 2 years, the No campaign had been warning that independence was fraught with economic risk. Now, one of Scotland's iconic businesses was next.
As Chancellor Exchequer, I was responsible for the Royal Bank of Scotland. It was owned by the British taxpayer. It's one of the biggest banks in the country. So as part of the contingency planning, with the British government in secret, the RBS had started to think about moving immediately its headquarters out of Scotland if this was to happen.
I had a phone call, and the phone call said RBS may move its headquarters, is planning to move its headquarters from Edinburgh to London. I had no reason to doubt the source I had. Oh, I was aware that RBS had not formally taken the decision, but it was pretty clear what the decision was going to be.
So, yes, that information found its way into the public domain. Rightly so, in my view.
Our political editor, Nick Robinson, has the latest.
Just in the last few minutes, what I'm being told, yet to be confirmed, that the Royal Bank of Scotland will decide tomorrow that they will move their headquarters from this city of Edinburgh, historic shift, down to London in the event of a yes vote.
If you were somebody who wasn't there yet, who was being held back, not necessarily because of your heart, but because your head was worrying about whether we could afford it, whether the economy would fall apart, businesses would leave, then the RBS thing was going to be something that just reaffirmed all those worries in your mind.
The next morning, the Yes campaign had scheduled a big press conference for the many foreign reporters now in Scotland, excited by the possibility that the UK could split up.
Well, good morning. Good morning.
It was an extraordinary event. I've never been to anything called an international press conference. And it was the world. Cameramen and reporters have poured in from around the world once the polling showed that Scotland might vote for independence.
Nick Robinson.
Thank you very much, First Minister. Nick Robinson, BBC News. Two, if I may. One specifically on RBS that you raised. Are you suggesting that the decision of RBS has no consequence, or do you accept that by moving their base to London, tax revenues would move to London, money will move out of Scotland?
It seemed to me that you have to have a beefy question for a moment like that. And what I was trying to do is get beneath the kind of micro detail and get to the nub of what it was really about.
Why should a Scottish voter believe you, a politician, against men who are responsible for billions of pounds of profits?
Firstly, can I just correct you on a factual point, Nick? The corporation tax does not depend on registered office, but on economic activity. For example, our estimates on corporation tax for Scotland at the present moment don't include.
I had the letter from the Chief Executive of the Royal Bank of Scotland, Ross McEwen, pointing out that this was largely a technical matter. So I answered Nick's questions comprehensively on a live stream.
So I then come to what I think is now the most interesting matter, which is who in the Treasury, because I have here a screen grab from the BBC last night. I don't know if this was you, Nick, or one of your colleagues. A Treasury source told the BBC that it had discussed the plans with the Royal Bank of Scotland. Market-sensitive information, and it's a basic rule, cannot be released prior to the market announcement at 7 o'clock this morning. The Royal Bank of Scotland share price changed overnight. This is a matter of extraordinary gravity.
I, at the time, didn't think I got a proper answer. I got a lot of detail, but I didn't think I got a real answer, which is why we ended up with a kind of lively exchange.
This is an international... Sorry, Nick, I'm going back to our friends in international media. Please, there. I mean, I'll tell you what. Well, I've just read you the statement. Well, right. And I answered that question. Nick, this has been a lively campaign with heckling at many meetings across Scotland. This is the first opportunity the BBC have had to heckle at a meeting. Congratulations, Nick. I answered you.
As the cameras then turned towards you, as they did to me that day, of course your heartbeat races, your pulse quickens. You suddenly realise you've become the story and not the guy who should be the story. It's a nervous moment.
So I think that's a reasonably comprehensive answer, Nick. And then, of course, I know that given I've given you a comprehensive answer, we'll have the full cooperation of the BBC in the inevitable inquiry which will now take place. Can I go to our friends in the...
If that had been the end of it, this testy exchange between Alex Salmond and Nick Robinson might not have mattered. But then the BBC's political editor wrote his script.
And I wrote the script line, he didn't answer. Now, looking back, even the addition of the word really would have made it better. Because in the end, it was a subjective view as to whether he did or didn't properly answer the question. And that's really up to viewers to decide, not for me. So it wasn't a clever script line. And in truth, you know, given the chance, I would have rewritten it.
We put the video up of Nick Robinson saying that Alex Salmond hadn't answered the question, and then we attached the video of Alex Salmond answering the question for 7 minutes to it. And it got hundreds of thousands of views on YouTube.
Each side had their propaganda wing. For the yes side, there was Wings Over Scotland. And for the no side, well, there was the BBC.
You know, I know how hard all my colleagues in London work at trying to get it right. You believe that. It's in your DNA when you're a BBC journalist, and I'm not cynical about that at all. But I was quite surprised by some of my colleagues failing to understand their own assumption that the yes side was wrong, and that some of my colleagues, by no means all, not even a majority, but some of my colleagues who thought that our responsibility was to produce a series of pieces that would demonstrate how foolish it would be to vote yes.
I'm joined now by our political editor, Nick Robinson. A warning for you, some viewers may find parts of his report complete bollocks. Well, the news I'm hearing tonight, Hugh, is a new poll published tomorrow but leaked to me tonight, Hugh, suggests that the chances of your pet dog, the one with the waggly tail, Hugh, being put down with a bolt in the skull are 100% greater in the event of a yes vote. Does Scotland want that on its conscience? Only Scotland can decide.
Clearly, people would come from their own perspective, possibly with their own thoughts, but I felt that these were left behind, that people were doing a professional job as far as was possible in every situation that they came across. Our response to the protest was to absolutely keep doing the job to the best of your professional standards in terms of truth-telling, fairness, and making sure that you get the balance of the arguments represented properly.
Several thousand people were amassed behind a banner describing me as a liar. You know, I'm laughing now. It's a really unpleasant experience.
Yes supporters had been objecting to the BBC's referendum coverage for months. This was the third anti-BBC protest in 2014.
I think what you saw yesterday was an expression of anger, an expression of hurt that some people felt the BBC wasn't doing its job as a public service broadcaster.
OK, over what, though, exactly? I mean, is the media, the BBC particularly, being condemned for drawing attention to things that the Yes campaign just doesn't want to hear? Does it not want to have pertinent, pointed questions?
The default tough question for me and for people from the Yes side was, why on earth would anybody want to leave the UK? Whereas the default tough question to the No campaign was, why are you running such a bad campaign?
As a public service broadcaster, we had to be robust enough to be able to absorb criticism wherever it came from.
I didn't at all want people to be demonstrating outside the BBC. I'd much rather they had been out in housing estates around Glasgow and elsewhere persuading people to vote yes.
Do I think it was the turning point of the campaign? You know, clawing back the extraordinary reaction to yes being in the lead for the very first time? No, I don't. I think much, much more important was the vow, the promise, the commitment, the soft option.
6 days earlier, on the afternoon the Daily Record had put out its See No Devo headline, the editor picked up his mobile.
I sent a text to a former colleague, a former editor of the Record, Bruce Worrell, who was at that point working for Gordon Brown, saying, look, can you broker with Cameron a front page vow that we can publish with the three leaders signed, that we can put on the front page to allay the concerns of the readership of the Daily Record that what you're promising will be delivered. The next thing, I got a phone call from Gordon saying, I love it.
You had a timetable for change and that had now been agreed, but now you showed there was a will to change. And so until all the party leaders stood up and were counted in this way. But after a request from someone in Scotland, in this case was the Daily Record newspaper, then people would see for themselves that this was a policy and a proposal and therefore a promise, and that's why it was called a vow, that people could not go back on.
We're going to give you lots more powers. We're making it not just a promise, but a vow. Quasi-religious in its terms and presented on a fake piece of parchment in the front page of the Daily Record. That was pretty effective as a technical exercise and very effective in terms of campaign psychology. And I think probably for some older, traditional Labour voters who'd moved gradually to yes, I think for people like that, the idea, well, listen, we can actually get a move forward without risk was an attractive proposition to make.
Unlike any other campaign that I've been involved in, the last few days of the referendum campaign, we had an embarrassment of riches in terms of the number of stories that were taking place.
Basic economics suggests prices could rise.
There's a sign of real belief.
What was happening essentially was there was some announcement by somebody, and before we were able to then rebut or respond to that announcement, there would be something else.
No UK pensions, no UK passports, no UK pound.
I think in the closing stages, the poll showing that it was neck and neck and that it should go either way, it certainly consolidated people's views.
There was no such thing as a protest vote. People had to vote for the thing that the outcome that they wanted to happen.
We had our internal polling that showed that we had moved from being 4 points behind, and we watched in those final days as the polls gradually moved back in our direction.
What about you? If you had to vote tomorrow, what would you vote?
I'm quite an individual person, so I like to make up my mind on what I've seen. I think I decided literally a day or two before polling day because I had the vision of something better than we had at the moment, and I think the no side promised a lot more for Scotland.
Neither side was really sure of victory. Secret contingency work began in London and Edinburgh.
We had done so much work. We had done so much planning. We had civil servants ready to move into a transition team.
There was detailed contingency planning that I did with the Governor of the Bank of England because we thought there would be a real risk of financial panic or disruption in the financial markets as the rest of the world suddenly looked at the UK and said, well, hold on, it's breaking apart, who stands behind its banks, what's going to happen to its currency? All of those questions would have been asked, and they would have been asked within seconds.
Would there have been difficulties and, hiccups along the way and things that we had to maybe, sort of tweak because of change in circuit? Of course there would have been.
The final speech for the No campaign was broadcast live. Gordon Brown had joined the cross-party effort.
When the future of your children, the future of your country and the future of your community is at stake, you cannot stand back.
Just before the referendum, I went along to Maryhill Borough Halls. Alistair and Gordon both appeared that day, and it was the culmination of at least 2 years of work from Alistair. And to have both of them together, I thought was really important. And the event captured the zeitgeist.
I've known Gordon Brown for over 30 years, and this was by far the best, most powerful speech I've ever heard him make. It did everything you'd want in the final stages of a campaign.
I was only one of the speakers on that day, and obviously everybody else should, and rightly so, have their chance to put their own views. So I think my remarks were 10 minutes, or just perhaps a bit over, because no speaker who's told 10 minutes does 10 minutes. They usually do 12 or 13. So I had to condense my remarks. So I had to think very carefully about what were the missing messages.
Scotland does not belong to the SNP. Scotland does not belong to the Yes campaign. Scotland does not belong to any politician, Mr. Salmon, Mr. Swinney, me or any other politician. Scotland belongs to all of us.
You know, I started off by saying that we were proud that Scotland had led the United Kingdom on so many different occasions and in so many different ways.
The Scotland that was the author of the right to work here in Glasgow and the right to free healthcare. The Scotland that helped build the...
When I was 77, I'm an old Labour man, really. Come from a Labour background. And he was speaking all the old-time religion. And I knew this is having an effect, particularly on the older Labour voter.
This is a decision that cannot be reversed or undone. This is a decision from which there is no going back. This is a decision when once it's done, it's done.
In many ways, conveyed our overarching argument, which was that Scotland, if you wished, Scotland could be independent. It's a choice.
If every one of us just goes out and convinces 1,000 other people, we've got this one.
By the last weekend, I was pretty convinced we were going to win. In fact, I remember saying to my husband, I couldn't sleep for days beforehand. I would sort of lie awake half the night. And I remember saying to Peter one day, I'm not sure what I'm lying awake worrying most about, winning or losing.
Right, I've got to ask you guys to turn the cameras down a second while I get off.
I was more hopeful than convinced at that stage. But yeah, I thought we could win.
If this goes the wrong way, this is an absolute national tragedy. It'll be, of course, the only thing the government's remembered for.
I was watching the week before the stuff unfolding and things happening and the vow and everything else going on and thinking, I just thought if I can give people that leap of faith, that feeling of, well, if I can sing and press that button and put it out there, then just take a leap of faith too and go and vote yes and, don't go for the fear, go for the hope.
I don't know, but you can see the changes that have come over me.
I said, you know what, I'm going to sing one verse of Caledonia. I did it in my 90. My mum was black-affronted with me.
So I've been telling the stories and singing the songs that made me think about where I came from. That's the reason why I seem so far away today.
This guy's as pushy as a cameraman, honestly.
It was an incredibly emotional day, and one of the things I remember was the number of people. Some of them I knew, some of them were complete strangers who were crying on my shoulder on the way in to vote. I spent a lot of that day, quite close to tears.
I worked through the day in Glasgow. I was at phone banks and I was knocking up, but there was no work to do because everybody was voting.
I posted my vote in Aberdeen. I wanted to do it from where I was from, in Aberdonian, and then I drove down the road. I actually got a speeding ticket coming down the road in the A90, actually. Sorry, Mum. And then came to Edinburgh, and I can't describe the feeling. It was a very misty day. I remember I went to Starbucks to get a coffee, and people were just looking at each other and how have you voted, and all the rest of it. Some people wouldn't speak to you, and you could see the tension. It was palpable. You feel it across the populace.
That day flew by. And then it got to about 10 o'clock, and after more than 2 years of intense activity, suddenly we had very little to do.
I think of all the evenings I had in Downing Street, including, by the way, the night of the European referendum, there was no moment as nerve-wracking as that night as we waited for the Scottish independence result. I mean, there was a real sort of pit in our stomach, and there's a small dining room in number 11 Downing Street where the Chancellor lives, and we had a takeaway Indian curry, David Cameron, myself, our close teams, and just waited for the result, because at that point there's nothing you can do.
On the night of the vote, I did a show at the Travers. The plays were great fun. It went very well, a lot of laughing. And I remember thinking at that point, you know, we're down under the ground, and it's almost like I thought, what if we start hearing like a rumbling, you know, and it's like suddenly tanks from Redford Barracks, you know, sort of like or what if we hear a riot, you know, or what? It was like, it felt so extraordinary, a moment of possibility. And then,
please, we're now ready to declare the statement of local totals for
Clackmannan.
Yes, 16,350. No, 19,000. 19,036.
You always think, the next one will be better. In your heart of hearts, I knew that result meant we weren't going to win.
I told the team, I said, look, you know, it's one result, but you know, I wrote, at that stage, for the first time, I wrote a concession speech.
I was convinced we were going to win, despite the polls, despite everything else. I still thought we could pull out the bag, and then the Clackmannanshire result came in. We were a long way away from where we should be. And I just thought, I'm knackered, I need to go home and see my family.
It's a shame for that county because its name will forever be associated with just disappointment for a certain set of Scottish people. And Clackmannan was we just knew, you knew. And in fact, the bar emptied.
If you offer me a fun campaign that secures 45% of the vote, or a winning campaign that secures 55% of the vote, it's not for me a difficult choice.
Nicola Sturgeon, do you concede that no are going to finish ahead?
I'm not going to concede anything when we've still got a fair number of results still to declare, but I certainly, accept where we are.
In some ways, the hardest but also the easiest interviews I've ever done. Hardest because I was so heartbroken, but easiest because I didn't feel any need to pretend that I wasn't so heartbroken about it.
Prime Minister said, right, I'm going to bed, but I don't think he could sleep particularly well, so he reappeared. He got two of his children, Elwyn and Nancy, to come down in their dressing gown to be there for the moment.
The total number of votes cast in relation to each answer to the referendum question in this area is as follows. Yes, 114,148. No, 139,788.
The result in Fife has taken the no campaign over the line, and the official result of this referendum is a no.
The vote is over, and the Scottish people have now given their verdict. We have made a decision for progress and change, for Scotland and within the United Kingdom. Come on, Scotland, let's get on with it together.
I don't for one moment regret it, but, lots of times and I thought, I wish somebody else was doing it. I didn't enjoy the campaign. I thought, it wasn't a joyous exchange of different views. A lot of it was pretty unpleasant stuff. And, at the end of it, I thought one financial crisis and one referendum, that's enough for anybody. I want out.
I thought I would be very relieved, but it was slightly disappointment, and I'm not quite sure why, because it went the way that I'd voted it to go. But I think I was somewhat, at the back of my mind, slightly intrigued to see how it would turn out. And I think that was the same for a lot of people.
There was enormous relief. I wouldn't say it was joy and jubilation, and like when you win a general election, that feels great. This was just an enormous sense of relief.
So I really expected that I'd be running around with my T-shirt over my head like a footballer that scored a goal, and it didn't feel like that at all. I didn't realise that I'd just had dread for, it must have been months, and it went away. And it was honestly the oddest feeling in the world. It wasn't what I thought I'd feel.
I hadn't allowed myself to get drawn into that, what if we win, what if we don't? I was really just taking it as it came. It wasn't until about 7 in the morning when I got home and I just cried my eyes out, so I did.
I should say I also felt quite a lot of sympathy for the other side, because
As much as I was, on one level delighted that they'd lost, the only people who understand what the other side had gone through were us.
Earlier in the summer, Alec had told me that if we didn't win, he would step down as First Minister and party leader. And I'm not sure I believed him. I spoke to him on the phone. I think he phoned me when I was on my way through, and he told me, no, he did intend to step down.
Mostly everyone were at Dynamica at that point. Nicola Sturgeon was there, and obviously all the party staff were there.
We just all, I think with the exception of Alec actually, we just all burst into tears. So we're all sort of crying and hugging each other.
And had a right good greet. It was quite a weird moment.
And then we sat down. Alec took a call from the Prime Minister.
Even before the polls had opened, David Cameron had been planning for what would happen after a no victory. Some in the Conservative Party were unhappy with how he had dealt with Scotland.
The day before the referendum, David Cameron rang me. I remember vividly, I had to interrupt my constituency surgery office in Sheffield. He said, I now need to sort of tack the other way. And so I'm going to, I'm minded to announce that we should make any further devolution towards Scotland contingent on providing greater powers for English votes on English matters. And I said, well, you can't possibly do that as a government because I don't agree at all. We've made an unqualified and unconditioned commitment to the Scottish people.
Scotland is only one part of the UK and actually not, of course, as big as, for example, England. And so it was important to speak to England in particular, and that sense in England that there had been a lot of attention on Scotland recently, and what about them?
We have heard the voice of Scotland, and now the millions of voices of England must also be heard. The question of English votes for English laws, the so-called West Lothian question, requires a decisive answer.
Cameron was proposing that Scottish MPs should now be excluded from votes on purely English matters in Westminster.
So too England.
By the time I spoke to him, I said, why are you doing this? I said, the attention should be on the fact that we won the argument, that, we need to move on, and you're opening up a second front.
Thank you very much, and good morning.
I remember emailing him saying, this is just so utterly depressing. We've won the referendum, narrowly, and now you go away and throw it all away and risk actually sowing the seeds for eventual Scottish independence.
I think that's all nonsense. First of all, the SNP were put firmly back in their box. And as for the Liberal Democrats, well, they were, virtually wiped out in Scotland. So I'm not sure that what they had to say after the referendum had much resonance.
The politicians all kicked in again, the crying stopped, and suddenly we thought, right, so you haven't listened to this result or what it signifies at all. This is not over.
I don't think that the effects have unravelled yet. And I'm not talking about whether people might vote one way or another. I'm talking about the emotional effects. I think they're still embodied within the individuals who participated and within the body politic. I think the wounds are very present and raw. They've not healed, and a lot of time will have to pass.
After the referendum, Andrew Dunlop and Andrew Cooper were made Lords by David Cameron. In November 2014, Nicola Sturgeon became First Minister of Scotland. Mary Black defeated Douglas Alexander to become one of 50 new SNP Members of Parliament in 2015. George Osborne became editor of the London Evening Standard, and Nick Clegg an executive at Facebook. In 2018, Murray Foot declared himself a supporter for independence. Stephen Noon gave up politics for the priesthood. Amanda Brown campaigns for a new independence referendum.